Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled The Future, How We Can Reach the Brave New World of Diverse and Equitable Clinical Trials. My name is Ryan Muse, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, this webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you get involved. So please feel free to submit any questions or comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to them during the presentation. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using this same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. Now, at this point, I'd like to thank Syneos Health, who developed the content for this presentation. Syneos Health is the only fully integrated biopharmaceutical solutions organization, including a contract research organization, CRO, and a contract commercial organization, CCO. Together, they share insights, use the latest technologies, and apply advanced business practices to speed customers' delivery of important therapies to patients. And so now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker today, Nick Kenny, Chief Scientific Officer of Syneos Health. Nick, you may begin when you're ready.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Thank you to everybody in the audience for dialing in to listen to our discussion today. If you would like to move to the next slide, please, Ryan. Really just to begin by framing up that this is the fourth and final talk in a series of presentations that we have tried to put together, if you like, to create an arc of dialogue, beginning with, as you see on the 27th of January, a discussion about really what does diversity for patients in clinical trials mean? How do we unpack those issues? We then heard from various stakeholders across the drug development spectrum on the 3rd of February about what are operational challenges that everybody faces in trying to drive sustainable and meaningful change to include diverse patients in trials. Following that, on the 10th of February, we heard from leaders, for example, at Winship Cancer Center at Emory and Bristol Myers Squibb and other groups, about case studies where people have attained that meaningful change, to really encourage people to recognize that this is possible. It's not a nice to have, but it is a highly feasible, both scientific and ethical imperative that I think we should all embrace. And then today, what we're going to address with our two panelists is where do we go from here? What additional policy innovations and changes might be needed to really make having patient diversity become a normal part of what we do and not something that has to be thought of and pushed uphill every time. So the two panelists that I have with me today, as you'll see in the next slide, I'm very fortunate to welcome Peter Pitts, who is currently president of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest. Peter had a former tenure at the FDA as an associate commissioner for a long time. He is also a visiting professor at a medical school in Paris. And you will have seen Peter is widely published around regulatory and healthcare policy issues around our industry. So Peter, welcome. It's great to have you join us.
Thank you.
And I'm also thrilled to welcome back Dr. Stephen Keith, one of my own colleagues, who is a senior medical director with Syneos Health, who brings a tremendous run of experience, initially as a pediatrician in practice and training other physicians, but also in executive level positions in biopharmaceutical companies, as well as a position up in DC, working with the mechanics, if you like, of what policy and change is needed in healthcare. So Stephen, Peter, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you join us for the discussion. And Ryan, in the next slide, I'd just like to begin a short run and set the stage for our audience. You can animate this slide too. This should not be a surprise to any of us, I think, listening to the presentation today, that we can all see the lack, if you like, of patient diversity in many of the therapeutic areas where we're looking, whether it's diabetes or myeloma here. And importantly, what we've all seen is that the COVID-19 pandemic and development of both vaccines and therapeutics for COVID-19 have really shone a new light on what, frankly, is a long-standing problem that our industry has been slow to adapt to and really drive meaningful change. And in the next slide, what we've really tried to do here is just to summarize for the audience that long run of both regulatory and policy initiatives. So going all the way back to the demographic rule in 1998, there have been a series of advices and guidances coming forth from both NIH and from the FDA about the importance of including diverse patients in collecting appropriate data, whether it's age, gender, race, ethnicity, what have you. And the most recent of those is summarized in the next slide, Ryan, which was a very elegant guidance that was formalized just late last year, where the agency was sharing their best thoughts about how to include diverse clinical trial participants, looking at things like inclusion, exclusion, and study design parameters. Certainly a well-considered document that the audience should familiarize themselves with. But I think what you would certainly hear from Peter and myself and Stephen today is that despite all of this great work, and despite efforts like the guidances that came out from FDASIA in 2012 and the agency's action plan in 2014, I think it's fair to say that there has not been significant movement in this space. And so, Peter, with that, let's just jump right in at the deep end. What's your perception about why we haven't seen that movement, despite all these great guidances and advice and recognition across the industry of the need for change? What's your perspective?
Well, clearly, the status quo is a harsh mistress, and you can pass legislation and you can write rules and guidances, but actually having people pick up on them and follow the letter of the law and follow the spirit of the regulation, something else entirely. It's very easy to do things the way you've always done things in the past. Certainly up until the very recent future, any discussion of, well, we need racial and ethnic diversity in clinical trials, the answer was no, we don't. We're all the same under the skin. And we've learned to our hopefully future merit that there's social value in diversity in trials, and the COVID-19 vaccine experience certainly is front and center there, but also we understand genomics a lot more than we did, and we recognize now that the differences that people have on the genetic level count, and they count in extremely important ways. So clearly there's a societal issue here. We want to make sure people can see people like them in clinical trials so that they both enroll in clinical trials and take the medicines that are coming out of them. And secondly, that we really can enhance value relative to patient outcomes on the genetic level, which we're doing, and that has racial and ethnic implications, no doubt. So, the words are on the page, the laws are on the books. Now we've actually got to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's very well said, Peter. We have to do it, right? And Stephen, I know you and I have talked a lot about this. I think there are both scientific and ethical reasons that we have to get this right. As Peter is saying, we have to do it. From your perspective, as you look at new studies, we've talked a lot about assessing disease burden, because at the end of the day, really, very simply, all we're trying to do is to develop drugs in the people where the disease is, right? And I think we've all seen that there are specific diseases where we're not surprised that we've done it for a long time. I know you and I have talked about Tay-Sachs, you could pick up sickle cell, all of those things. But my sense is that we need to look at every disease with that lens. What are you seeing from a medical perspective when we look at new protocols? Are we there?
Well, the quick answer to that is no, we're not there. Right. And I think we've got a tough road to go, because when we even begin to talk about these kinds of issues with specific sponsor companies on specific studies, it's always you're running into a perception that to collect the information about the disease burden for different populations, that's going to take too long. And if we're suggesting to be very intentional in terms of site selection, it's too expensive, it's going to take too long. These are all perceptions that are not based on data. And the data really demonstrate that if you are intentional, it doesn't cost any more. You can do that fairly quickly. And in working between the CRO as well as the sponsor company and divide up the responsibilities, you can get this done. And all of it is to the benefit of the quality of the data, the quality of the trial, and coming up with some insights that you may have missed if you didn't have that kind of intentionality. So that's what we're seeing right now. I'm optimistic that we can do better in the industry, but it's for this to be widely accepted, I do believe we will need additional kind of enforcement of requirements to do so because it's the right thing to do.
Right.
It's got to be table stakes. It can't be a nice to have. It's got to be a must do.
Yeah. No, I think you're both spot on. It has to be a must do, right? And I think maybe a question, I'll throw it open to both of you. But, if we look back at all the great data that we can see about multiple myeloma as a good example, right? The agency's actually dissected the data that has landed on their desk in multiple drug approvals over the past 10 years. And it clearly was not representative of the people that have the disease. So if you work backwards from that, would it be unreasonable for the FDA to expect that when you show up, let's say in multiple myeloma, that either your pre-IND, your end of phase 2, certainly before you get to your registrational studies, that you show them the disease burden and your plan to address that, both in your protocol and your recruitment plans? Peter, is that a reasonable thing for the agency to expect at those meetings?
I think that it definitely is. I mean, if you think about what the agency is not interested in. So the FDA is not interested in how much money a drug company can make on any given product, or how the clinical pathway to success influences their financial wherewithal. When you go to JP Morgan and you listen to various presentations, disease burden is represented in pure numbers. It isn't broken down. From an FDA's perspective, the financial wherewithal of those numbers is interesting. It's not important, but what is important is how do you make sure that the drug under investigation actually delivers on its promise. And you can't do that without understanding the disease burden within various communities, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's religion. You can cut it any number of different ways. And I would say that if the FDA says, listen, we are going to put on the label what this representation looks like, so that doctors can be better informed. That was discussion way back in 2006 with the DIL, that unless doctors understand the clinical trial breakdown, they can't be as informed as they need to be. So another FDA piece here is, how do we better inform practitioners as to what this drug looked like in clinical trials and how that might manifest itself in the real world?
Yeah.
And Peter, you just reminded me of kind of an example that could be well understood, I think, by our colleagues in the industry as well as the FDA. Several years ago, it was thought that breast cancer was a pretty, uniform disease, and was either plus minus just on the question of breast cancer. And then we were able to identify specific markers for different population sets, and then the development of therapeutics based upon those subsets by markers, genetic markers. It is the same kind of exercise going through to understand the disease burden of all diseases in different racial and ethnic populations and others, and then to be able to understand, okay, what's the efficacy profile, what's the safety profile, and companies were eager to be able to find the subsets in terms of breast cancer. We should call upon them to have the same kind of energy when it comes to identifying, minority, majority populations, and not just in the U.S., but around the world. We do have these same kind of issues, and so, there's pushback, but I think that there's an awful lot of data and justification to say that these are important that they have to do.
Right. Also, relative, the kind of the carrot stick thing, a lot of the expedited pathways that the FDA has in place now is to reward companies to invest in disease states that are more and more specific and identifiable. But right now, we're talking about endpoints and surrogate markers, but we're not thinking about that as broadly as we need to. Obviously, within any disease group, there are subgroups, and clearly, ethnic cuts are an important one. We can do it. It simply requires more work, better thinking, better use of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And there are guidances coming out of the FDA on all of these things. So, clearly the CRO comment is going to be initially with respect, Nick, that, gee, this is going to be hard, it's going to be more expensive. We're not really sure how to do that. Well, it's time to learn how to do it, and catch up to the immediate present where these things are real. And then, of course, capturing this evidence after the fact in real world data to make label extensions as appropriate.
No, I think those are both, you're both making great points there, right? I want to maybe pull that back together. I think you said it well earlier, Stephen. The more that we do these things, the more that you'll have high quality data that instills confidence, right? And for example, I remember listening to Dr. Najal last week, and if you look at how a lot of immunotherapy drugs were developed in oncology, minorities represented about 1% of those trials. And yet now they're out in the world, and we're going to discover something new perhaps with real world data. It really instill you with a lot of confidence if you're putting these drugs into people who have not seen them before in a clinical trial setting. So, and I think to the price point too, that clearly is a myth, because we have huge swathes of people who are underserved by clinical trials that if we're able to access them, actually can accelerate your ability to run the trial and get to a yes/no decision a lot sooner. So I think all good points. I mean, Peter, Stephen, what do you see as some of the precedents that we might draw upon to encourage both FDA and industry to really pay more attention to this? And I think one of you said it, to do this intentionally at the beginning of your trial and not look at it as an afterthought. What sort of precedents have you seen either in other nations or by label? And Peter, one of the things you and I talked about, I think, is this idea of separation of process from policy. Can you maybe articulate a bit about that?
Well, we're coming up on PDUFA reauthorization, and people always want to hang ornaments on the PDUFA Christmas tree. And FDA remind people that PDUFA is about process, not policy. And when it comes to clinical trial design conversations within the FDA meeting process, that's clearly a process issue. And this isn't saying that every drug for every condition every single time is going to require a sophisticated cut on the audience. You still have blockbuster drugs, but even within blockbuster indications like cardiovascular medicines, in the African American community, you have a very distinct, large population. And I'd like to kind of do a retrospective analysis and say, of all the cardiovascular drugs or beta blockers that have been approved over the last, pick a number, 20 years, what does the ethnic diversity look like in those trials? And my suspicion is we'd be pretty surprised that it is not representative of the patient population. So not only do we have to look at it for blockbuster drugs, but clearly for more targeted therapies, we're doing it. And so we need to do it right. Nobody's complaining that they have to do extra clinical trials. Well, that's not true. They are complaining about having to do extra clinical trials in Japan, but they do it. Why? Because they have to. So sometimes forcing people to do the right thing is the path you have to take.
Exactly.
And Nick, and towards that, we have been, as was indicated on the slide that you showed before we started talking. I mean, guidance and encouragement has been provided from the agency, or as well as NIH, over the last 20 some odd years, and so far we're not there, and we're just beginning to actually recognize that these are issues, that is within the industry. I think we need to do more than encouragement. We need to do more than just suggest and provide guidance and kind of nudge people along. The nudges are not working. And so I think it is time for us to step up in terms of requiring, or other, if we use the carrot and stick analogy, a bigger stick and not so much of a carrot.
A stick that's inserted in different places as well. I think maybe a good example are pediatric trials. Not forthcoming, hard to do. You have the PREA requirement, but really, have we made significant advances in pediatric trials? We have not, and we're failing right now relative to COVID vaccination trials for those under 17. That's urgent, and it will happen because it is urgent. But to Stephen's point, you can put the guidance in place. People will say the right thing on podiums at various conferences and in front of Senate and House subcommittees. But at the end of the day, it's not happening. So you have to make it happen. You have to make it a requirement, because all of a sudden, when things are required to move forward, magically they happen. So the carrots could be a certain type of designation for greater or swifter review. It could be ultimately patent extension. I don't want to get out of control, but or specific labeling indications, and that will help. But I think you have to do that in tandem with the threat of your program dying inside the agency.
Yeah. So actually, I want to pick up on that thread, because you both lived and worked inside of the let's say, the machinery inside of DC. Share with us a little bit about what is it like to try and enact change in that environment? How does it all fit together? And then pulling through on that, here we are coming up on the nomination of a new FDA commissioner. Are we looking at an opportunity around that nomination to try and work these things in here, notwithstanding, of course, the heavy focus on the COVID pandemic? But maybe, Peter, start off with you and then pass it to Stephen. What do you think about that current environment?
Well, I think the value of seating senators with questions for a FDA commissioner nominee is terrific, because unlike PDUFA, which really becomes etched in stone from a legislative perspective, the questioning of a nominee can put a stake in the ground. And I think that a couple of smart questions saying, tell us about your position on advancing diversity in clinical trials beyond the societal need, speaking specifically to the scientific need. What's your plan? Who are you going to empower? Can you report back to us in a year and give us a report? I think that's potent, because they're on the record, they're on television, and their feet will go to the fire.
And I totally agree with that. And Nick, you asked, what's the perspective in terms of likelihood of these kinds of things moving forward? The first thing for everyone to really understand and acknowledge, for any legislative initiatives that try to approach new ground for which there's not already a precedent, they actually take a couple of years to get through. It's not something that can happen overnight. And it is a tough slog to be able to not only come up with a good idea, and then you have to figure out how to get it done within the current structure of the law. You have to get, kind of advocates who agree with you from broader spectrum of constituencies beyond just the pharmaceutical industry or the CRO industry, which is, much less vocal, because people will look at the pharma industry and say, oh, okay, you're just trying to figure out how to make more money. You've got to get advocates that recognize the benefit to the population, and to populations that are not receiving the highest quality of healthcare. Those are good advocates, but all of that has to come together. And it's a tough process. This is not meant to be a civics lesson, but just for people to understand, this is not something that can be implemented from either a legislative or a regulatory perspective overnight. It takes time, but
that's a really
it
good
won't
point.
happen unless you get started.
Right. I was going to say you have to get going.
One thing the FDA does very well is, it hears the voice of Congress, hears the voice of the people, and they say, listen, here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to commit within this time frame to have a series of meetings on this topic. We're going to get input from a variety of organizations and constituencies. Very important. It needs to be inclusive. And then we are going to write guidance from that. And we will have a guidance by a date certain. And that moves the program forward, because this can't be ad hoc. Science is hard, and it's got to be properly regulated. And the way you regulate science and clinical trial design and regulatory review is having guidances and rules in place that people understand and follow. It's got to be predictable. So if we can add a degree of predictability to advancing diversity in clinical trial design, I think we've done ourselves a tremendous service. Right.
I think that predictability is a critical part, Peter. Right. There's a very timely question just came in from the audience. I'm just going to read it straight out. So during the course of the FDA COVID vaccine review, the agency said it would not force companies to enhance diversity in clinical trials, so no quota system. And this is being reinforced, I think, in the agency's guidance. And the pharma guidance, which we were all talking about earlier, is pretty much the same. So who can make this a requirement? Where does that authority reside is what the question is asking.
I think the major authority resides with the FDA. And we will have to, figure out, how that's going to work out in this current administration. I'm not surprised that was the ruling from the previous administration, because many of those decisions were not made at the agency based upon science, but were made in the White House, for instance, where it was much more of a political or a ideological kind of consideration. I do believe that in this current administration and for the next 4 years, more decisions will be made based on science and public health, which is a good thing. And the data is already there. we already know that there's a significant problem, and we do have a lot of guidance that's already been put forth on how to approach these problems. So I would hope that the response coming out of the FDA is not to set up another commission. We know how to do this. We just have to figure out, okay, what is the scope of what's going to be proposed, what's going to be implemented, and how many people can get behind it to make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, sins of omission are seldom fun. You know, we've got to go out there and we know, to see if it's what we know how to do it. We simply have to make it front and center. And I hesitate to use the word mandatory, but you need to put guidance in place that strongly suggests that if you don't do this, things will not be as positive as you might like.
Yeah, there'll be consequences, basically, right? Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think that was a good question from the audience. Stephen, sorry, go ahead.
No. I think Peter's right. There have to be consequences. I mean, for instance, when the requirement for seat belts was made, yes, the car manufacturers were very much opposed to it and said it would cause more delay and be more expensive. And then when everything settled down, the one thing that was certain is we saved lives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, seatbelts is an extreme example relative to the saving lives, but if we can facilitate the development of better data and more information about the safety and efficacy of pharmaceutical products, medical devices, and other healthcare interventions in different populations, that will result in saving lives and improving health for many communities.
Yeah.
And so the carrot and stick in many respects are in the same pocket protector. Because just like seatbelts, where if you didn't want to enact seatbelt legislation on the state level, that's okay, but then you couldn't get federal highway funds. You know, a lot of what happens inside the FDA is companies want, obviously, their program to move through the agency as quickly as possible. And one of the ways they do that is to apply for certain types of expedited designations. And the agency could say, well, we can't give you this designation unless you do these types of diversity that's in your clinical trial. We're bound by that regulation. We'd love to get this. We'd love to give you accelerated approval or expedited approval, but unless you do this, we're not allowed to do it. So your choice.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a choice. You're right. Stephen, you made a good point earlier in that dialogue about there are ways to do this, right? And we heard that, I think, last week from some of the panelists,
right.
And certainly the tools are there. There's great guidebooks, not just from the agency and guidance, but from groups like MRCT, put that beautiful, well-considered guidance from all the stakeholders that was put together over the past 3 years. And it brings me to a question from the audience that is sort of interesting. It's why are sponsors not willing to simply involve community-based organizations? And I think that's an interesting perspective because we've heard from everybody in all of the previous webinars that we've had that community engagement is probably one of the more powerful things you can do to break down barriers to access so people can get in. I think it's important in the sense too that we have to recognize that in many diseases, clinical trials are part of the healthcare continuum. So by denying somebody access to a clinical trial, you're actually denying them equitable healthcare. So where do you think the hesitancy is the question from the audience is saying, about engaging with community-based organizations?
I think anytime that you recommend and propose something that's different from what various organizations have done over the years, their view of what is successful, it's difficult to try to convince them to change that course. And all of us in the industry, the companies are very used to going to the same clinical trial sites, using the same methods to recruit patients. And, so it's like, there's a perception of it's not broke, so why try to quote fix it? However, in, this effort to develop the vaccines for COVID-19, the companies learned that to be able to recruit patients to join the trial, engaging community organizations and institutions was a very valuable tool. Going to the churches to recruit patients from African American populations and communities, going to those churches, and using trusted individuals in those organizations, such as the pastor, to recommend enrollment, and now once the vaccines have been rolled out, to recommend that people go get vaccinated, has proven to be very effective. Now, we just need to use those examples to say in other indications, let's use the same techniques, not only to enroll in studies, but to make people aware that there are therapies that are available that can improve your health. There are things you can do. One of the issues that we have in terms of COVID right now is that increased morbidity and mortality is related to the presence and extent of overweight and obesity. There's an article in one of the Chicago newspapers that says, going to the churches and using them as a forum to talk about the impact of obesity and the power and things that people can do to, kind of reduce their overweight, which can result in better outcomes, not just in terms of COVID, but in terms of cardiovascular health and diabetes and all the other things that we know. These are trusted voices, and they work. We should be doing these things. We know the things that can have a positive impact on the development of products.
I mean, think about this. Think about 10 years ago, if I had said to you, 10 years in the future, patient organizations are going to have impact on surrogate endpoints inside the agency, people would have looked at me like I was absolutely out of my mind, and yet it's happening. Just as CROs have their favorite sites and their favorite investigators, they can similarly have their favorite community organizations, and that's okay. It gives them the opportunity to train them to talk about inclusion and exclusion criteria, to bring them into the game beyond their race, but also as experts and learner intermediaries. And another group that we really haven't discussed yet are IRBs. What role can IRBs play in saying, this is a great design, show me your plan for diversity percentages and why that is, and how you're going to achieve it. So, we need to broaden the scope of people who become our allies in making this happen.
And we also have to be careful not to, I think a lot of the people who are in this audience are familiar with an IRB, but we also we're going to be addressing others that are not within the circle of pharma development. And so Institutional Review Board, IRB, we have to be careful to make things understandable and to communicate in ways that a broad audience can really understand, because then they'll be helpful in terms of getting these things done.
And perhaps more often than not, the membership of an IRB needs to be representative of the issue we're discussing.
Right.
So, Peter, I want to pull on that thread a little bit because it's an excellent point around institutional review boards, right? We all know, I think, about their role in looking at protocols to say, are they scientifically correct? Are they ethically accurate? Should we engage in this research? And it's not a stretch, I think, to expect that an IRB would look at it and say, are the right people going to be able to get into this trial? Do you have a plan to include them? That's an ethical gatekeeping activity, much like the rest of their mandate. You're right. And I think as a microcosm of the diversity that we need, not just for patients in trials, but everybody that is touching part of the development program, whether it's our labor force as a CRO, whether it's representation on the IRB, but I think importantly, that trust thing we've all talked about, healthcare delivery, physicians, nurses, site staff, if we don't have the diversity there, people are still going to be distrustful. So it starts to look very quickly like you really need to attack this from all ends and sides, right? There's the people part, the legislation part, and then all the downstream things like IRBs, as you point out. It's a great point. If we don't have diversity and representation there, it's going to continue to be an uphill struggle.
I think there's an acknowledgement that these new tools and techniques don't come for free, and pharma companies or the CROs that they work with are simply going to have to accept them as the cost of doing business in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Right.
Stephen, I think you were going to say.
No, IRBs, institutional review boards, at the present, Typically, we'll have a representative that's not a physician, that's not an academic, that's not in the industry, kind of a general population perspective, to be able to provide that perspective in the consideration of different protocols and other aspects around the conduct of this research. And we really do need to encourage that those IRBs reach out to those populations that have been historically underrepresented in those capacities to provide that perspective. It's not only folks who look like you, have PhDs, and or senior positions in major corporations that can provide that perspective. Our frontline workers, our hourly wage workers, have the same kind of perspective as to, okay, does this sound right? Is this the right way to conduct a study? And to bring the additional perspectives from communities that just haven't had a voice in these discussions.
What's interesting, kind of from the COVID vaccine experience, is we focus a lot on nurses, for example, that don't want to get vaccinated, and they're the voice, they're the face of healthcare in their communities. But it goes beyond that. It's basically anybody that works in a hospital. If they're going back to their community saying, "I'm not getting vaccinated," they're the face of healthcare, to their friends and neighbors. But also, I'm going to get killed by people inside the FDA. On advisory committees, there's an industry representative, there's a patient representative. Perhaps we should also have a diversity representative on these advisory committees who, Stephen, to your point, that's what they're thinking about. And even if at any given committee, it's not super relevant, they're there. And so and they're present, visually present, recognize this is an important thing that has to be addressed 100% of the time.
Right.
No, I think that's a great point, Peter, because what you've just done is you've moved that to become the new normal. It's not ad hoc. It's not because we're trying to deal with it. It's like, this is how we do business. It's part of what we have to do. And I think that's really where we want all of this to get to, right? Where it's embedded in all of our psyches, that when we think about designing a study or developing a drug, you design it in the right way, you get it to the right people, and you collect the right data. It's that simple. I wish it was that simple. In principle, it really is.
And some of it, I think it's so important, because if you're presenting in front of an advisory committee and one of the members on the committee asks you about your plan for this, you go, well, I don't know. It's not going to be pretty.
No, exactly.
Yeah, there have to be consequences to not knowing what you're going to do.
Yes. So that's an interesting tipping point for me. Let me see if I can frame up the next question here. So clearly, when we were talking in advance of this call, we're trying to strike that balance between, you do not want to delay a drug getting out and approved to treat unmet needs, but at the same time, you don't want that to happen without these considerations, right? So I think what we talked about earlier is that the further upstream we can pull that into initial discussions between a drug developer and the agency and at the IRB level and all that stuff, you would hope that by the time you get to an approval and an AdCom, it's already taken care of, right? We don't want to be doing this post hoc. But thinking about this from a slightly different direction, do we see any role for payers, for reimbursers of drugs, to be engaged in the stick part of this, that they may not reimburse for a drug if it's not appropriately developed? Or is that too late?
Well, it depends kind of what the drug is for. I mean, clearly, drugs that are moving through the FDA process through these various expedited pathways oftentimes get stuck up because the payers say, well, there isn't enough data for us to really reimburse for this drug, which is a whole other conversation. But clearly, if you've got solid data that shows efficacy, higher efficacy rates in certain types of populations, that should absolutely impact reimbursement, and CMS should be at the front of that line saying, we're going to look at that before we make our decisions.
And I think, and not just efficacy, but safety as well. I mean, payers should be very sensitive to fully understanding the safety profile for any new product, because if in fact there are adverse events, serious adverse events, as a result of a difference in a safety profile, they're on the line.
Yeah, exactly.
This is dollars and cents, and so I think they'll pay attention. They should pay attention to that.
And I think that speaks to also the need for relative to safety and efficacy in certain populations from a post-marketing perspective. The real need to get with it and collect data in new, sophisticated ways, so that we have an earlier indication about how these drugs are impacting all sorts of patients by cut 100 different ways.
Yeah.
And Peter, you just kind of ticked off something else, because this is not just a process limited to phase 2, phase 3 in terms of development, but really must continue through if a phase 4, i.e. post-marketing approval study is required, these same kind of questions should be answered. These same kind of data points should be examined. And then through the real world utilization of any particular product, because there are several examples of where we really don't learn about the safety and efficacy profile of a new product until a couple of years after it's approved, when we see it out in real world and we have more than the few thousand or maybe 10,000 patients that have had it during the development stage. And when hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients might have had it, then we truly do understand some of those signals. So we need to pay attention to this throughout the lifespan of each product.
And that also is a role for community organizations, to be a source where people can go to report side effects or report adverse events. So you kind of narrow down the signal to noise issues of simply pulling them off the internet. So I think there are roles for various communities to play throughout the development pre and post process.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think, if you look at the way that, so people miss out on getting into trials for all sorts of reasons, right? Let me just pick up one. So inclusion, exclusion criteria, right? They're often written just because that's the way we've always done them, right? People don't challenge them. It's like lab values, right? And yet we've seen clear examples, I'll go back to multiple myeloma, where a lot of those inclusion, exclusion criteria were not designed with the end patients in mind. So you're immediately excluding a lot of African Americans because of a lot of the comorbidities around things like obesity and cardiovascular disease. And yet the moment those drugs are approved, who's going to take them? People with all those comorbidities, right? So it was encouraging to see the agency actually recommend in that most recent guidance that people should think about this ahead of time and say, what does your intended patient population look like? And scientifically, can you safely broaden your inclusion and exclusion to get those people in so we don't get those post-marketing surprises when the drugs get into a broad population, right? And I think people, again, it's getting over that hesitancy that industry has had. It's like, oh, well, we've always done it that way. The tighter we can make the screws in the protocol, the better the data is going to look. Well, that's good to a point, but if it's not representing the patients and the disease, then it's just a bad equation. Yeah.
I think patient organizations have a role in this as well. Because they need to recognize their own need to extend their memberships to broader communities.
So the community part is still interesting to me. Do you think overall in this sort of broadening and diversity, are there lessons we can learn from the rare disease community? Because they became very vocal about wanting a stake in designs and what were meaningful endpoints. Are there things we can learn from that community, or perhaps even from years ago with the way that the HIV community lobbied very hard for change? Are there lessons we should be looking back to bring forward, so to speak?
I think the one big lesson, and this is also relevant to the FDA's patient-focused drug development program, is you have to teach patient organizations about regulation and about clinical trial design. They don't think about it. Initially these groups came together for social and emotional support, and that's terrific, and that's an important role that they play. But if they want to play a scientific role, they've got to learn to speak the lingo, and that's got to be taught. So the question then becomes, who steps up to the plate? Does a pharmaceutical company step up to the plate and fund these programs through third-party groups? So rather than CME being continuing medical education, it's civilian medical education. So you can't expect people from day 0 to day 1 to be experts in clinical trial design and drug regulation. Someone's got to teach.
I agree.
So Nick, to answer your question, I think we can learn from the rare disease community, and they were very effective in terms of their coming together with various organizations around specific rare diseases, and then the National Organization of Rare Disease, and it really was that impetus, that pressure, that raising of awareness that led to the enactment of the orphan drug legislation starting in 1983. They were very effective. And so I agree that we could learn. And then, you know, since that time, or around the same time really, was HIV. I mean, the activists and constituency groups around HIV were so effective at, you know, kind of really pushing for rapid evaluation of studies and rapid consideration in the agency. I can remember, you know, when there was one of the very early drugs went through the agency, and it, you know, from the time that that application hit the door to the time of the approval was a week. We learned you can do this. We've seen, you know, rapid development of vaccines in COVID-19, so we can replicate these things as long as we've got, you know, careful attention to not compromising on true safety and efficacy stuff. But we can do these things, and patient groups, constituencies, consumers do have a role to play in this entire process.
Yeah.
And what the FDA has learned is they can't just pat patient groups on the head and say thanks for coming in. Here's a cookie. They have to be part of the process. I think that CROs specifically, or people who are deeply into the science of clinical trial design, the patient voice is extraneous. It wastes time. It takes their eye off the prize, and that whole dynamic has got to be kind of totally re-engineered.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, Peter, because I think we're seeing that re-engineering happening. So I think a couple of weeks ago, we heard from Kathy Traz at BMS about how they had a senior level mandate that all of their protocols had to have that patient voice look at them for portability, acceptability, practicality, and if it was going to be in a particular setting, even think about endpoints. What was a meaningful endpoint in that patient group? And I thought it was interesting that BMS said about this in a good way, that instead of expecting individual program teams or clinical operations teams to figure that out, they created a central resource to help them do that. So they had a consistent approach, and they took the burden away from the clinical teams and helped them through all of that.
And that's progress. With a lot of these very hot issues, pharma companies are fast followers. So if the competition is getting kudos for that work, that bodes well for pickup elsewhere.
Yeah. Just an interesting comment coming in while we've been talking is that
Right.
The difference, I think, in patient advocacy groups of rare diseases, that they generally do know how this is done because they've done all their homework. So we've got a different set of hurdles to cross when we think about diversity and engaging with community groups. All right, so it's a good point from the audience. Thank you for that. So I'm just conscious of time, guys, and I think one of the things I would love to do is recognizing that many in the audience will be people from a clinical operations background looking for practical solutions. What one or two things would you advise the folks in the audience to think about doing in their drug development plans, trying to address this issue of patient diversity? And maybe, Peter, if you could lead us off.
Well, I guess, it depends who's going to take the lead. I think that CROs have an opportunity to take the lead to have this conversation with their clients. They need to be the ones putting it on the table, explaining why it needs to be done, and explaining how it can be done. So from a CRO perspective, I would say, think about these issues, think about what you need to do to make them happen, and then how to present it to your potential clients.
And I'm very pleased to say that we at Syneos are beginning to do this and to hopefully learn from one another and broaden that out because it should be something that's done with all studies. And the first thing that we really need to do for each study is to identify what's the epidemiology of a particular disease and a target population, and what data is already available that could suggest a disparate impact on the incidence or prevalence of the disease, the severity, other risk factors. So to identify, okay, what are the conditions that we really need to pay attention to? There may, and I think we will be surprised at the amount of information and the spectrum of target diseases for which there are different profiles relative to incidence, prevalence, severity, risk factors, concomitant treatments, the lack of other treatments for particular populations, and other factors that we should take advantage of. You have to be aware of the magnitude and define the problem before you can take actions.
Right, and also that this is not exclusively for new drugs. This is for drugs that are currently on the market that can glean data and make that happen. Because let's face it, we're still using Herceptin as the example here. It's too many days have passed not to have better, more current examples. Nothing succeeds like this.
Yeah, but I want to draw together a couple of themes that you've both touched on, right? Which is understanding the true nature of the disease. And then Peter, you mentioned earlier using things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I think if we weave those two things together, we can get back to one of your points, Stephen, which is about quality of data, right? Because if we think about, again, you might pick up on multiple myeloma, but the way that the disease manifests in different subgroups can be quite different. Age at onset, outcomes. When you dig into real world evidence and look at actual outcomes, there are significant differences in different populations. And if your data package has just got that all rolled up into one thing, you're going to miss some important either safety or efficacy signals. You might not get a drug approved because you haven't fished those things out, because you may have mixed and matched people who had early onset disease, late onset. They may progress at different rates. But if you can tease that apart in a valid way using evidence out of medical records, you have a much more robust data package. You're actually better off investing that time and money to understand the totality of the disease, not even just the epidemiology, but the burden and the way it flows through. And certainly, we heard from Warren White last week that, groups like Concert and others are able to map out patient journeys and show you how those things look and who's getting what medications at what point. And historically, we haven't been able to do that. So I think, one of the things I would advise listeners is make sure you understand all of the aspects of the disease, not just the sort of the top level of it, right? Because it may inform some different subset analyses and study design issues, right? And I think that's going to be a broadly applicable rule, really, certainly from a lot of the diseases we've seen.
Right, and I hope that one thing that is that our audience takes away from this whole discussion is there is no single magic bullet to solving this problem or making things better. We need a multifaceted approach because the problems are multifaceted, and we can identify it from epidemiology. We can try to kind of target specific populations. Then we have to go out and recruit patients from those populations, and maybe kind of oftentimes have to really evaluate, do we have the right sites for this clinical research to be able to recruit that population? Okay, so then that's a matter of location and convenience. Let's talk about convenience. All right, if the study site is only open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., as many of our sites are, well, that kind of takes away people who have hourly wage jobs, who's a bus driver who can't get to the site in the suburbs easily. So that's a challenge that we really have to confront. And then who are at the sites. It's not sufficient just to have one person who speaks Spanish and think that you've really taken care of the issue. We have to be intentional in terms of the populations that need to be included in the studies and how to recruit them and how to make them feel comfortable, as well as trusting of the sites. And that's the last thing I'll talk about. We've already developed that. The data is pretty clear. If the physician and the nurse at the study site look like you and you're the patient, you are much more likely to say, yes, I'm okay with enrolling in the study. I'm trusting you. These are all, this is some of the factors that we need to pay attention to that are critically important. It is not a silver bullet to doing this. We have to do it all.
And it's hard and it's iterative.
Yes. We're not looking to, there's no switch available to just a turn, right? We have to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. So guys, if I was to wrap this up for suggestions to the audience as they think about this in their own programs, would it be fair to say that we should all engage in actively, and I think intentionally is the right word, Stephen, developing and enacting solutions rather than expecting that we'll get further mandate and guidance from on high in the near future? It may come along, but as you pointed out, things take time in DC. So is it incumbent upon us as an industry collaborating together to go out and make this happen in a meaningful way before being told how to do it? Is that a fair summary?
I think that's a very fair summary, that the industry, and when I say the industry, we're talking about pharma, biotech, device companies, CROs, et cetera. They should recognize, we should recognize that it's better for us to come up with real solutions rather than being told by government agencies, payers, et cetera, that this is what we have to do and how we have to do it. I think we understand how best to do it and do it in the most efficient and cost-efficient manner. So we need to take the initiative before we are subject to onerous requirements that may not get us where we really should be.
Right. And the problem, you can lead, you can follow, you can duck and cover. Unless the industry, Stephen's point, kind of broadly defined, chooses to lead, you're going to get it's going to become political. And let's face it, our elected representatives are not technicians. They're going to demand things that are the wrong things, but that play well in the media. So, and believe me, as we were talking about earlier, this is not the only issue where we expect industry to step forward. But times are changing. 2020 was a year of enormous change in a number of different directions, and it's not going to go away. We can't just keep our eyes closed and wait for it to vanish. It's going to happen, and we can either make it happen ourselves as an ecosystem, or we can be combative, which really, at the end of the day, benefits nobody.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, Peter, Stephen, thank you so much for your time. That was a really engaging discussion. I hope the audience found it useful. I think you had a lot to offer. And so, Ryan, with that, let me pass this back to you for a wrap up and closing us out. Thank you all.
Yes, and thank you for that wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time here today, but if we couldn't attend to all of your questions or comments, the team at Syneos Health may follow up with you, or if you have further questions, we encourage you to visit Syneos's Insights Hub online. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. I'm about to send you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll actually be able to view the recording of this event on this page. You can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording there as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, of course, join me in thanking our speakers for their time today. We hope that you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.